So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I want to just say a quick word about West Shore Fact. We are a very dedicated group of environmental activists. We work to shift the way we live and think about our planet and our place in this web of life. West Shore Fact has been together for about 10 years, and we have taken action through a number of things: testimonials in Ohio's General Assembly, marches in at DC, performances in Parade the Circle. We collaborate with local and national organizations, and we have many, many, many community conversations like the one that we're having today. We promote clean air, clean water, healthy soil, and a quick, safe, just transition to renewable energy sources and sustainable living. You can learn more about us at our website, at our Facebook page. We are also on Twitter, Instagram, and on YouTube, and I can put those links in chat as we go through. So again, thank you everyone for being here, and I'm going to turn this over to Ann.
Hi, we're organizing this at Cleveland, Ohio. So we want to acknowledge that Cleveland sits on the land of these native tribes: the Erie, the Seneca, the Lenape, and some of the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. So thanks again for coming today. I want to just introduce Mark Cohen. We're very grateful to have Mark do a presentation for us today. This is the first of 2 presentations he's going to do for us this year. Mark has devoted his life to the study, nurturing, and teaching of the symbiotic relationship of living organisms with their environment. Mark studied wildlife biology when he was in school, and he left academia to study with indigenous communities in Central America. He worked in Central America for 27 years as an ethnobiologist, and he founded the Agroforestry Research Center in Belize. Currently, he is an organic certification inspector for the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association, and he's also co-founder of the Far Valley Farm Co-op Community and Land Trust in Amesville, Ohio, where he lives. Mark is going to do a presentation, speak first, but he is going to leave quite a bit of time open for questions. So if a question arises, please put it in the chat. And when Mark is finished, Linda and I will take turns reading questions to him from the chat. So it's with great pleasure that I present Mark Cohen.
Well, thank you very much. Good to be with you again up here on the lake where I grew up. And I'm really appreciative of the goals, or the goals of your group. I think there's some very strong points, particularly in identifying that the quality of our soils and our water, and the way we integrate cultural choices of energy are right on the money, but even more so, the recognition that interfaith unification is a big piece of this. And the reason I say that is that I think that we're looking at a 4-legged stool, in a sense, of in order to get things right. And I don't see historically people getting things right without the faith-based piece. And I would just generally call that spirituality. But essentially ecology, sociology, economics, and spirituality are the 4-legged stool that I'd like to, come from. So in our previous conversations, I thought that maybe this talk would be good to just sort of step pretty far back and look at the large sweep of our experience on this planet and what has worked and what hasn't worked. I'm going to emphasize the things that worked because they're the most obscured. Plus, we kind of need a little bit of upbeat something once in a while. However, I'm not going to ignore the gravity of the moment that we're in, because it's really critical that we kind of get on the same page about what the priorities are and which aspects need our attention the most in order to buy ourselves the time to get the other pieces right. I would call this critical thinking. So I guess to start that off, it seems to me that the downfall of pretty much every civilization we can name has a common theme. And we know a lot of these stories pretty well, but most likely not assigning the right causation to the collapse of these civilizations. I think that some of the other pieces that look problematic are secondary to the primary reasons. And the primary reasons, as far as I can tell, are always about hydrology, about soils, and about the vegetation that really maintains those soils and builds them. And the water that is essential to all agendas, right? So the key to water is going to be soil, and the key to soil is going to be plants and animals. And that's going to be a very circular story that we're going to keep coming back around to. But we can talk about, the Greeks and the Romans and numerous other examples of places in the world that left us with a desertified environment. So 40% of the landmass of the earth is man-made deserts at this point. And that is pretty heavy duty legacy for us. I think not that we did it, but I think that we have to be very careful to look at how we're supporting the same mistakes today and to move beyond that into a regenerative footprint. I think that's the general desire of all of us. And I would say the vast majority of people in general. However, I don't think that our educational systems are teaching the basics of how to think about that. I've recently been looking at some of the indigenous thinking. Our conference at the Soil and Nutrition Conference of the Bionutrient Food Association that I've been involved in kicked off their conference here recently with a friend of mine who's a Native American Mayan man who really spent a lot of time exploring what does it mean to be colonized and how to decolonize our thinking. And I've been looking at this quite a bit lately, and it's very interesting that our language itself is part of the problem. And what I mean by that is when we talk about a person or a thing or a commodity as a noun, we've already severed all of the incredible number of ecological relationships that go out into the world from that noun, which is actually ecologically a verb because it's in relationship. I'll just mention that briefly, because I think that there's a very strong psychological component to this whole story that has to be addressed. And we will provide some links. I did a panel discussion partly on this that's in the links that you can watch at length. And then also a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to go into great detail on the data and the slides, whereas there's a almost 3-hour talk that I did last winter on this that you can refer to if you're interested. So this 40% of the land that has been turned into deserts has been a methodical process of most groups of people in terms of really, first of all, cutting down the trees if it's a place that there were forests originally, and then you get into sheet erosion and then eventually, ultimately, into starvation and disease and fire and so forth. So one of the things that that struck me recently, I'm working with what I think is a very important group called Ecosystem Restoration Camps, and John Liu, phenomenal thinkers, and they're starting these ecological restoration camps all over the world. They're really on fire. It's something that I think all of us should consider supporting, because this is way beyond what we can do in our backyards, but here's a way we can really intervene ecologically in models that can literally spread on every continent, and they are. John's work originally was a journalist, and he documented a project in the Loess Plateau of China. And it was a place that was originally very fertile and really amazing, and it was reduced to essentially a moonscape. I mean, gone as an ecosystem, couldn't support really anything. And over a period of 14 years, he documented a program in China where they worked out an agreement with the local people who were not real supportive of planting trees on land that that was seen as kind of you know, in the way of what they wanted to do, farming, you know, desperate type of farming. And over 14 years, it went from a moonscape to a terraced green lush landscape. I mean, it's really stunning. And he's got examples in Rwanda, in South America, and in the Middle East that is extremely hopeful. And so the idea of these camps is that they're setting up camps, and anyone who supports it can go and visit them and help work on the restoration. But it's also kind of a democracy school and a place to practice getting outside of a nationality, a nationalism, into more of a global community of people working together to restore the biological function of large areas of land. I can't say enough good about it. John Liu came to my talk last December that I just mentioned, and he was in the crowd and pretty quickly talked me into being on the advisory board. And I just, you know, recently this spring, see, they did, it's on YouTube also, if you want to go on, there's a 6-hour presentation that was called The Great Work of Our Time. And but one of the things that from an article that he wrote, because they're looking at the Sinai Peninsula as a very important project eventually, and because you can see from satellites where the original waterways were that have been dried up in the Middle East. And what's interesting to me right now is that if you go back, this crosses over into some of the other things I'm going to talk about. But if you go back to, say, 6,000 years in northern Africa, in the Sahara, it was once basically a savanna. It was not a sand dune like it is today, and it was a man-made desertified situation. And we're seeing this playing out all over the world. But about 3,000 years later from that desertification event, you see this thing in the Middle East where the stories of all the religions are talking about a Garden of Eden, you know, the land of milk and honey, Canaan, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got what you see today. So in the restoration potential for this area of the Sinai, which they see as, I mean, it literally looks exactly like a heart from space. And you can see the lines of flow in that heart of where the rivers used to be and so forth. And what fascinated me was that, you know, approximately 3,000 years ago, when the desertification of the basically denuding of the landscape with goats and other animals and just generally cutting down the forests that were there, something happened that they seem to have evidence that when it was the Garden of Eden, essentially, that the winds were coming out of India from the monsoon rains in India, and a lot of the biodiversity, the insects and birds, were flowing into the Middle East from India. And when the desiccation of the area occurred, that the winds changed from India, instead of India coming from Africa. And so this previous event 6,000 years ago, and you know, it took a while to do, But the point is that the dominoes were starting to fall from this man-made desert in Africa, and now, you know, the winds are blowing in this dry air from the previously caused desert, and then and displacing this this biodiversity from India. So, and now California is burning. So we can recognize these patterns or not at our own peril. But the point is that this is an old song and dance, and we really need to integrate what it takes to do the opposite of this drying out of the landscape. Because if you don't have water, you virtually don't have anything. And all of the biodiversity management that we will talk about requires water. So this is really a story about water, even to the point where water is actually, and I know this will be a little controversial to some, but it's actually very well established science, that water in different forms in our biosphere is determining 95% of the heat dynamics of the planet. So what we're seeing as global warming is about 4 to 5% CO2 and other greenhouse gases, and about 95% dynamics of what form the water is in the atmosphere. It's a very powerful greenhouse gas, but depending on what form it's in, and what I mean by that is that a lot of the aerosols in the atmosphere, including CO2, including a lot of industrial byproducts, and also including a lot of natural aerosols, are in the form of hazes. And there's some very large blocks of hazes over some of the largest cities in Asia and so forth, and also in the Sahara. And my understanding is that there's about 12 inches of rainfall potential in the Sahara, and it virtually doesn't happen because it's in the form of haze and not clouds. This is just a little bit technical here, but basically there's 3 ways that water turns into vapor from haze particles, which are 1/1,000,000th of a raindrop in size. And when they're in these hazes, they let light through, sunlight through to the surface of the earth, and they capture it. It gets held in the water essentially, but 4 or 5% of the CO2. So when you start looking at, okay, how does the earth really manage this? And how do hazes naturally turn into vapor and then clouds? Because cloud cover is really the opposite of hazes in terms of warming. And because the cloud cover reflects about 30% of the sun's heat before it ever gets down to the ground. And then when it rains, it releases energy and does some cooling. There's lots of dynamics around when plants are evapotranspirating. They're also cooling, very much like the body. When our skin is sweating, it cools. And so it's very similar to our bodies, that the earth needs to be covered with vegetation. It's really critical, and it's far more important than all of our other strategies probably combined. So the reason I say this is that there's and I'm against fracking and nuclear power and all these things and have been forever, but I want us to be effective with the time that we have. And so let's make sure we don't miss the biggest opportunities that we have. And I would highly recommend, listening to some of Walter Yenne's talks. I've given you at least one link there. I can give you others. I've spent about 7 days with him in the last 2 years, and I'm absolutely stunned by the implications of what he has to say, not only in kind of reminding us, I mean, he's a retired scientist from Australia. He worked with CSIRO for a very long time. He's an incredibly knowledgeable guy, and I highly recommend getting that under your belt to understand where we are in our time historically and what the potential is. He's been traveling all over the world, with this message, and he came to California particularly because he's saying that we're probably within 10 years of it tipping into something that we won't be able to reverse. And what that something is a heat dome, where the temperature is hot enough to where it creates a dome that the moisture in the air that would have been rain can't get above it to rain. But quickly back to the point about the hazes, there's three ways that raindrops or that vapor forms in the world, and over the oceans and around the coast, it done with salt crystals, which nucleates the hazes into vapor. There's the other way is ice that's high enough in the atmosphere or high enough and low enough latitude-wise for that to work. And pretty much everything else is bacterial, from bacteria, and there's specific bacteria to trees that, from what I understand, live in the stomata, which are the opening and closing pores on the underside of tree leaves, and then through evapotranspiration is propelled into the air to be able to nucleate those hazes into clouds, which then reflects light and then also gets us rain and cleans the air and so forth and so on. So there's a world of complexity in terms of how this incredible planet works. And with a rudimentary understanding, within a couple, 2-3 hours, you can really begin to understand this, because there's really 3 watts per square meter on the Earth that's heating out of 342. So it's really only that 3 watts, and we can accomplish the change in that warming in multiple ways, and ideally multiple ways simultaneously. But even if we were to just increase the amount of green cover on the Earth, amount during the growing season and the amount overall by 4%, that would equal the amount that the planet is warming. Also, if you were to increase the cloud cover by 2% through tree planting and many other strategies, but trees are going to be involved in almost all of them. I've been doing a lot of work and looking at how to make the landscapes that feed us much more resilient in the changing climate that we're already seeing and the much more extremes that we are going to be seeing. We can do a lot to climate proof a lot of these landscapes. I wouldn't say proof, but give us way more leeway in much more difficult conditions than we've seen yet. So there's a big piece there. Like I said, I'd like everybody to kind of have a look at these talks, and I'm happy to share more of them and even possibly set up a talk with him. He agreed to do some Zoom conferencing recently when I asked him, because I'm trying to get him to do something down in North Carolina. But I can't emphasize the importance of what he has to say enough. So the thing that I didn't really get at, we talked about how 40% of the world is turned into man-made deserts, but the part that's much more obscure is the brilliance of traditional environmental knowledge by First Nations peoples. We have a history that's been told by the invaders and the thieves, and it's not accurate at all. Meanwhile, there's examples all over the world of absolutely stunning ecological knowledge that has been basically swept under the rug or ignored. And again, it's such important information. Some of the examples I would give would be, I'll give you 2 quick ones. One is really California as we know it, was when Europeans arrived, was essentially a spiritual garden built by native peoples for a very long time. And not only were they thriving, in significantly higher numbers than people think were happening at they weren't like a civilization in the sense of like the Incas or the Mayas, but there was a lot of people living there, and they were using the land in a very regenerative way that was increasing the biodiversity. There's a couple books I would recommend on that if you're interested. There's a woman named Kat Anderson, and she wrote one called Tending the Wild and Before the Wilderness, because in for Native peoples, there really wasn't a wilderness. It was all home. It was all a spiritually steward landscape. And it didn't have a lot to do with commodities. It didn't have a lot to do with a lot of the way we think today. And I think we need to understand a lot of those dynamics because their agriculture wasn't like on farms. It was the whole planet was, we ate from the oceans, the rivers, the lakes, the wetlands. I mean, every landscape had wild foods and didn't have to be dominated so heavily in order for food, single function landscapes just for human food, that they understood the essential necessity for biodiversity to be present, for us to be present. And we're smart enough to know how to do that in the way that they harvested mussels from the coastlines or deer or any other animal, extremely sophisticated knowledge of the timing and use of fire to establish and build very healthy ecologies. We don't really understand fire well. We don't understand water well in terms of what happens over long periods of time. We don't seem to have developed an ethic that looks to how do our actions impact 7 generations into the future. I mean, this was like, again, a spiritual practice that was the core of who they are. And when you burrow into a lot of these healthier relationships, wherever they happen, you tend to find a different sense of what the self is. The self isn't really something that's temporary and separate from this larger matrix of life. It's all connected very clearly. And so I wanted to mention that, and we could go on all night about examples. The other one that really has affected me greatly, having worked in the tropics for a long time and looked at the difficulty of maintaining carbon in the landscape, say for building a compost pile, and then I would come back up to Ohio and farm for 8 months and then go back down there for 4 months every year. So I would see what happens, every year. And, I could build a compost pile that was pretty good size and come back 8 months later, and there would be, a 5-gallon bucket or two. I mean, the hot tropical sun, it really increases the digestion of carbon and the oxidation of carbon back into the atmosphere. And so even like today in our gardens, when you put mulch down or manure or other organic matter, it's basically back in the atmosphere within 20 years for the most part. And so when I heard about this story in the Amazon basin of these soils that they found, it took them quite a while to figure out that these soils that were anomalies, I mean, there's 6.5 foot deep, black, rich soils, like off the charts amounts of organic matter in a place that the natural soils are almost non-existent in terms of organic matter other than on the surface. And so when they burrowed into this and started analyzing the carbon in the soils, they realized this was emanating from human generated soils or anthropogenic soils. I just couldn't even believe it when I saw this. And I can't think of another thing that humans have ever done that have got that kind of a legacy thousands of years, or at least 600 years later, that is still the most fertile soils in the entire region because humans built them. I mean, again, there's a lot of detail here, but the basis of it was charcoal. And the intelligent use of biochar, which I'm working a lot with and teaching courses on it. I'm beta testing the very first Stirling engine gasification system to turn cellulose into electricity, space heat, hot water, which could be season extension, and then ending up from that original material of wood or biomass into charcoal, which will last thousands of years in the soil. It's also incredibly useful for filtering water, filtering air, doing bioremediation, cleaning up toxins in the landscape in multiple different ways, I've designed a few systems for dairy farms to keep any manure from ever getting anywhere near a creek, E. coli, etc. So it's a very powerful tool if used correctly. It's a very dangerous one if used incorrectly, as we found out in the era of making charcoal for the steel industry and defoliating the entire Eastern United States. So everything has to be done with mindfulness and intelligence. You can cause lots of havoc with very good ideas if you apply them wrong or at the wrong scale. So we know that we can bring systems back. You know, we can see places in the world where there was originally a lush landscape and it was turned to a desert and it comes back. Other than the example I mentioned in China and others, there's places where you can see evidence that there were rivers, that there were trees, that you know, I think it was the island of Madeira, which was defoliated. And so the way they got those trees out was by floating them down rivers that don't exist now. So the trees and the rivers are gone. There's an island, Ascension, I believe, which was defoliated also. It's very easy to damage island ecologies. And there's a green mountain and a bald mountain on that on that island. And because the green mountain was replanted by people, and there's 20% more rainfall even within, you know, a fairly small area, you can see this change. And so with the knowledge of microclimate management, and you can see this, anybody who's ever gone out in a hot day, in a very dry time of the year and walked into the forest and felt that immediate coolness and moistness in the air, you know, has experienced a microclimate. And this can be done on a very small scale. And if we can aggregate enough microclimate work in all of the places where we live, we can functionally change bioregions and the entire biosphere. We did it in the negative, so why not turn this the other way, which is kind of the point of the whole talk. So I mentioned about taking landscapes and making them more resilient. I work with a lot of farmers. I've been, for the last 30 years, I've been working with organic certification, but in that process, walking a lot of farms, looking at a lot of livestock, looking at not only looking at them in a snapshot, but coming back for many years and seeing changes in their soil tests, seeing changes in biodiversity and many different improvements, and looking at what works and what doesn't. And so we have some very good tools for changing things around. For example, one of the most powerful rapid soil carbon generators is really intelligent grazing of livestock. You can get similar results with cover cropping, and I'm doing a lot of that now with very diverse mixes of cover crops, but you're generally on any kind of scale using tractors, and so you have to kind of subtract the positive direction you're heading in, subtracting off of that the whole kind of military industrial complex that's required for that. And it's very hard to do the math that you can do the same. If you can do the same thing with nothing more than electric fence and a solar charger and 100 cows, why wouldn't we? And so I've seen operations where there was 3% organic matter increase in 4 years, which is really pretty stunning when you consider that 1 percentage point of organic matter per acre is 28,000 gallons of water storage. It's literally a sponge, and this is really what Walter Jenne is talking about, is the soil carbon sponge. It's the difference of everything, of which direction you're going. If you had a single gauge of what we're doing on this planet, and could look at what different products we're buying or choices we're making in regard to whether we're increasing the soil sponge or decreasing it, that would be probably the best single gauge that I know of in terms of what is going to help not only all human beings, but all other species. And so there's above and beyond good practices, even that are generating, with grazing or with cropping and cover cropping and perennial systems, is the intelligent integration of tree planting. So if you have a pasture system that's working like I just mentioned, and you integrate a silvopastoral model of planting the right tree crops within that delicate range. I did a lot of work with shade crops and chocolate and coffee and tropical plants, and it was really a constant management of cutting trees that were taking up too much light and letting in sunlight and letting air movement come in to get around diseases and things like that. So there's a fair amount of sophistication to get it right. But if you do get it right in a really serious drought condition, in one of these pastures, the animals are going to be grazing all day long in the shade on not only the pasture that they had before, but there's a lot of species of trees that have high quality forage. The leaves themselves are high quality forage. So that can be managed by cutting, there's something called pollarding, which is where you cut them above the height of the animal, and you cut branches and let in light. You never kill the tree, you're just harvesting branches, letting them drop. The animals can eat the leaves off of those branches. You can gather those branches and make them into wood chips for mulch, growing mushrooms, doing biochar, energy, etc. But these landscapes really, if they're designed properly, should be giving us pretty much everything we need, at least for life support. And we have to do a lot of homework on what we need and what we want. Because we're kind of at the tail end of a very materialistic cultural pattern that has pretty much left a nightmare in its wake. But I think that we're not going to get away from currency. We're not going to get away from international trade. But I do think that with a really mindful, caring culture, we could get to where the majority of the needs are met locally without a lot of travel, because the thing could be, the product we're talking about, whatever it would be, might be the most sustainable and well-managed product, but when you put it in a package and you take it all over the planet in a globalized market system, you strap on a price that this planet just cannot endure with 8 billion people. And so it's really imperative that we localize, that we look at supply chains, and we see that the majority is coming from local areas, and there's still going to be room for ideally, well, for equitable exchanges between countries. There's a lot of kind of hidden slavery in our economic system that's by manipulating currencies around the world and making sure that some countries' labor is dirt cheap and their resources are dirt cheap, and that all kind of flows into these supposed first world countries, and it's there's just not a lot of future in it, and there's not a lot of ethics in it. Even if it could be sustained, it wouldn't be something we would want to do, in my opinion. And so when you look at the kind of 100% employment that comes from these kinds of diversified landscapes that have very high biodiversity, that are producing our building materials, our medicines, our foods. Our foods should be at least 90–95% of our medicine in the first place if it's nutrient dense and has the right stuff and it's fresh. The organization I'm working with, we've been measuring the nutrient density in different foods and developing a tool that's a near infrared uses light reflection, very much like astronomers are using light from different planets to see what minerals are on those planets. We can do the same thing with food, and some amazing things are coming out of it. Being the first year or two of using this experimentally has shown that in some carrots, carrots as an example and using polyphenols and antioxidants in those carrots as an example of what we're measuring, there was a 200-fold difference from the lowest carrot to the highest carrot. And there might be what, threefold difference in price. So if you can buy 200 times the nutrition for 3 times the price, you are getting a very good deal. Plus you're supporting the farmers who are creating a level of soil health that's incredible. So I do think we have a real issue with having less than 2% of the population growing food as farmers, and 98% of the people, even if they become relatively enlightened and want to buy from organic farmers, they're just not enough people to do it right. And so any way you cut it, we need a tremendous amount more producers. And I don't even necessarily even mean to sell as a commodity. 75% of the world's food supply is coming from smallholder ethnic people who probably are growing and consuming the food locally without packaging and travel. So it's fresh, which gives you a massive leverage point on the nutrition of whatever is in it actually getting into your body. And then if you can do it smaller scale, you have a better likelihood, not guaranteed by any means, but a better likelihood of being able to really care for that small garden. So there's a whole lot to talk about with nutrient density and how that impacts our health, because health is the other big looming thing, which is getting to be right about the same level of threat as the what I'll call hydrological extremes of floods, droughts, fires, and cold snaps, as Texas just experienced. As we knock this planet out of balance by removing the skin, removing that evapotranspiration, removing the exudates, the photosynthetic exudates from those plant roots into the soil, which is a really significant amount of the carbon that's on top of the root itself and the top of the plant itself in terms of biomass. We need to get this function back on. Just like if you were to lose 40% of your body's skin function, you would start to suffocate and have issues. The planet has the same issue. And I don't think we can expect those higher end regenerative practices to happen in large scale farming. However, I would also refer to Gabe Brown, who is a fantastic voice for regenerative agriculture, and his story is absolutely stunning on 5,000 acres of land in North Dakota, where he started with between 1% and 2% organic matter in his soils and really minimal diversity and lots of crop losses because of the lack of resilience. Over about a 20-year period, his soils are averaging about 7% organic matter and up to over 10%. And he's got levels of diversity in his pastures for his livestock that are like getting up close to native prairie. And he has no-till vegetables, and he's gotten so effective that all of his children and grandchildren have different jobs, from beekeeping and processing food. They've got so much diversity of enterprises within his farming operation that he's been able to cut his acres in half and sell off some of it. He's got people lined up to the horizon to get him to rent land from them so they can get their land improved. So it can be done at scale. So getting quickly back to the example that I gave was only for pasture, and that's not, I don't really want to only focus on that. Virtually all of the backyards and small gardens and vegetable operations can be put into a kind of a food forest or agroforestry type system, where an integration of perennials and annuals, because there really is no stable annual ecosystem on the planet. So we really need to diversify. Diversity is probably the single most important gauge. of how to make improvements, because with diversity comes a tremendous amount of biological self-regulation and stability. And as you go more and more toward a monoculture, you get less and less stability, and eventually will not be able to maintain it. There was an interesting study in Germany called the GENA study, I believe, Jena, where they planted cover crops on, I think they were they might have been 10 by 10 meters or 10 by 10 feet, seems small. Anyway, the point is they had all these different blocks of land, and they put one species in one and two up to 16 and above. And in a very dry drought cycle, what they found was that all of the blocks of cover crops died except for the ones that had 8 species and up. And interestingly, they were the same species that were in the 1 through 8 numbers that didn't make it, were the same species in these bigger diversified mixes that made it. And it's kind of pointing toward the diversity of exudates. Each plant has a different suite of exudates that are exuded into the soil and to feed the microbes. And so each plant is feeding a different group of microbes. And when you get up over 8, you're starting to get the mathematics start generating to the point where you have enough diversity of microbial microbes in that ecosystem that can be much more efficient with water holding capacity, water use efficiency, and such. And so there's just really fascinating things emerging in science now that are beginning to mesh up with some ancient knowledge. But lately I've been looking a lot at the ability of microbes to communicate among each other. This goes for the microbes in our gut, the microbes in the soil, on the rhizosphere of plants, where they seem to have an awareness of the needs of the host that they're riding on, in a sense. And they can actually produce, when you look at the sheer number of vitamins and antioxidants and all manner of compounds that are produced in your gut, if you have a diversified microbiome, and there's a world of problems if you don't. So what's interesting, that they're not only providing all of these different hundreds of different compounds that we don't have to look to eat in our diet because they're being produced. Well, really what it is that our diet is feeding this huge microbiome in our gut. And part of that food is going to, and actually it's a lot of the food is going to the microbes. The microbes are generating byproducts of digesting that food, because really our stomach is like the soil. It's like a compost pile. And out of those secondary products from digestion is what our body is thriving on. And but it keeps going. It just keeps going the further you look at it, because now they're showing that in this science of epigenetics, which if people haven't been looking at it, it's really exploding. There's a few areas that are really changing what we thought we knew. But in epigenetics, 90% of the genome, say if we're talking about human beings, 22,000 genes, 90% of that is not able to be traced to an outcome. But it's more a series of very complex switches. And those switches are influenced by many different factors, including our diet, including the quality of our water, what we hold, the thoughts that we hold in our mind. That's been really interestingly researched on the different emotional states that you are in a given moment can be traced into your bloodstream of what kinds of compounds are being produced by that thought process. And what we might call negative emotions like hatred and fear and so forth are generating compounds that are undermining us, like cortisol, stress. Well, cortisol is negative after you have sufficient amounts. But without going into a lot of detail there, my point is that the microbes themselves have the ability to influence our gene expression or a plant's gene expression. Like what actually happens is now very much known to be about the terrain or the environment that we're in. The same gene sequences can express themselves completely differently depending on the environment they're in. So massive implications in terms of health, and it comes full circle around from healthy soils to guess how those gut microbiomes get built. It's at least, well, to a large degree, it's from the food that we're eating. And ideally, we're eating locally. Again, we're connecting to those healthy soils that we're maintaining, and the whole thing comes back around. So there's a lot of reason for hope when we look at what happens when you start to get things right, when you just, at least even for a small period of time, just take your hand off the throat of natural systems and stop squeezing, it immediately starts to regenerate. And for us to get ourselves aligned with the processes of regeneration in our own bodies, in the soils, in the landscapes, is really where the future is, if we have one, which I'd like to think we do. And we'll do everything I can to see that it does go that way. So the take-home message is that all surfaces need to be covered with plants. There should be no bare surfaces. The longer of the year that you can maintain those surfaces with living roots, the better. I've had Austrian winter peas in a cover crop in February that were some of the sweetest, produce I've ever had out of the garden. So I mean, we can do a whole lot more than we think with this stuff. How are we doing on time?
Well, Anne, do you want to go ahead?
It doesn't matter. We're about 7 minutes from 4, so we have maybe 20 minutes left. So let me just let people know that if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll read them to Mark.
We have a lot of questions at this point.
Okay, good, perfect. Well, let's just go straight into questions, because I like that. It gives me a better idea of what thoughts are going on in your mind, and I can address anything else that I might have said through that process.
Okay. All right. So the first question that we have here is, you mentioned. Hold on, I'm sorry. There we go. You mentioned grazing cows is one of the quickest ways to add carbon to the soil. I assume this is from the dung. On a suburban lot, we can't keep a cow, but I do have a dog. We hear that we have to pick up dog poop, but that it's not fertilizer, but could we apply that same principle at home using other domestic animals? Is there something about dog poop that makes it unusable? Like, what about chickens? Is there, like, what could we do at home?
Yeah. So it's not really the poop. It's partly that, but it's much more of a dynamic of grasses and the incredible power of what they call C4 photosynthesizers grasses, where they can be grazed at the right timing. Like if they're 8 inches or higher of rapid growth, and you graze that down fairly significantly, but leaving, I think it's like take off 20% or so, and then you trample 60%. What happens is when you graze that grass, it sloughs off an equal part of the root underground, and the manures and the hoof action are breaking down that 60% that got trampled, and then the last should come out to something like 20% that's left, and then that regenerates. So the key to the system is to only graze it for 1 day out of 30. And I've seen some systems where they've they move the cows 4 times in one day. You literally have this super lush growth that you're managing that's at peak growth, and you've got an electric fence there, and you take that down, the cows just literally jump right into the new growth and they eat that swath, and then you move on. But the key to it is the regenerative part. Like if you were to leave those cows on that field for even 3 days, you'd lose a huge amount of that potential. And there's a lot of variability. I would refer people to the Savory Institute of Holistic Management. And Alan Savory did a lot of work in Africa for a long time, and he kind of learned the hard way of a lot of thinking that's really wrong. You know, they were culling elephants, thinking that they were, because it was desertifying. They were losing it, and they thought there was too many animals. And he kind of had a revelation that they didn't have enough animals. It just was how long they occupied a given spot and then had moved on. And it turns out that the plants are exuding exudates that are targeting the digestive system of animals that tell them to move on because it's semi-toxic. The plants are actually hurting the animals. And then you have the role of the predators, which are equally important because they're bunching them together in these large numbers. Anyway, we could talk again forever on that, but the point was that he was able to regenerate areas of Africa from really damaged to where they brought them back and reintroduced all these, rhinoceros and zebras and lots of the native species, but using cows to do it. You wouldn't even believe it until you see it, where there's rivers flowing with clear water where it was dry and places where people are starving and famines. And so we really need to understand that animals are not the enemy. And but they have to be used properly. Getting back to the dog poop, you can compost that. But for me, dogs play a really important role in in protecting the garden, and because otherwise, especially when you do a lot of work over the last particularly 10 years, I've made big strides on healthier soils and in turn much more nutrient dense food. And what happens when you go from really not very impressive health on food, what you're going to have immediate feedback on food that isn't very healthy or nutritious because insects are going to eat it. Insects and disease. So insects and disease are the garbage men of the system, where they're taking out the garbage. They tell you as a gardener, you failed, you got an F on your report card. But as you start getting better and better and more complex sugars, because things like aphids can only digest really simple sugars. And so it's to the point where when the butterfly is going through the garden looking for a place to lay its eggs, if the plant is healthy and has secondary metabolites in it and more complex sugars, then that insect knows that from a frequency perspective, that their babies will die if they lay their eggs there. They'll fly right on by. They won't even lay eggs on it. And it's true. They've done studies where they put like aphids or say, I can think of a potato beetle larva. The beetle forms of anything can take a whole lot more. They can digest a lot more than a larval form. A soft-bodied insect can only digest very simple things. So as you get more mineralization and biology in your soil, those plants are going to protect themselves. But when you start finding yourself getting past the insects and diseases, all of a sudden you find you've got animal pressure like you've never seen before. Day and night, things coming out of the sky, every animal in the book. So I've got fences and, having to spend a lot of time protecting crops, or you wouldn't ever get them in the place that I'm at, because I'm really in a wild I got lots of thousands of acres of forest around me and lots of wildlife. And I put myself there for that reason, because I started in wildlife biology and I got into agriculture secondarily, partly to feed myself, partly because I knew it needed to be transformed because it was the single biggest threat. And so when you start getting it right, then okay, but back to that question real quick to finish it up. Chickens are very doable on a very small acreage, and you can create a lot of nutrition. If you go to the psychological compatibility with diversity talk that I mentioned briefly, that's in the links that I did last year, there's a really amazing story about what happens even with plants that you think you can't grow under, like walnuts, that produce these allelopathic chemicals that keep other plants from growing. But there looks like pretty good evidence that we've seen among some people that I know that that those plants will only produce those chemicals if they don't have what they need. And with chickens, you can create enough nutrition in that landscape where the trees and plants that would have otherwise been incompatible with each other can begin to grow, to live together harmoniously. It's a powerful concept, and it translates into human sociology as well. And there's some interesting examples of primate biology where if you look at like chimpanzees and the aggression and violence that you see in the chimps compared to, say, bonobos, and then look at the food availability in that environment year round, you start to see a pattern that animals and plants get desperate and become less tolerant of each other when the resources get thinner and thinner. So if we really care about nonviolence, we had better get very good at being stewards of abundance in the landscape. Because that's the best way to avoid it. So yeah, there's more to that potentially, but since you have a lot of questions, I'll keep moving.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask the next question. Sandra Steingraber recently talked about vast ecosystems of microorganisms deep in the earth. And how fracking is likely harming them even before we understand if they are beneficial to the surface, surface ecosystems. Can you comment on that? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the first part is definite. I mean, there's an incredible, every time people look closer, there's more life forms found, like inside large granite boulders in New England. There's what do they call them? Endoliths that live inside the rocks and up in the pretty good ways up into the atmosphere and way down into the earth. As far as what the effect of fracking is on them, I mean, I don't know, but I mean, it wouldn't surprise me a bit if it's causing a lot of harm. I mean, I don't know anything good about fracking, so. And yet there are other things that are even bigger threats that we have to be mindful of. So yeah, so that actually points to we really need to get our needs met with benign forms of energy, with benign forms of agriculture, benign forms of all of the things that when you look at the whole supply chain of what we want and need, there's a way to take the time and do that right to where you get a positive biological footprint rather than a negative one. And so what you see with fossil fuel era of this country is that it's, we're burning at least 20 calories for every one we produce. So it's inherently putting us to sleep in terms of logic and rationale. That's just on the simple level of thermodynamics. Where it gets more complicated is how are things affecting cultural diversity? How are things affecting seed diversity and soil health and water quality, way down to parts per billion at least, maybe even trillion with endocrine disruptors. So we're in a very difficult era to get things right because the technology and the ideas are so pervasive and invasive that we can be against things all day long, but until we provide a better, higher quality way of doing something, we're not going to be effective in my opinion. So this is another reason why to have the cultural matrix in a landscape in an entire bioregion, taking responsibility for everybody in that region, making sure they have nutrition, they have energy, and so on. And we have really good tools for this now. I mean, you can only point to laziness to not do it right. But my understanding of what's driving things today is that I really think we have an energy crisis, and I don't mean the kind of energy that runs our homes. I'm talking about the mitochondrial energy, the cellular energy that gives people the confidence and the ability to take on difficult tasks and see them all the way through and stick with it for whatever it takes. What you find is that when people have really good nutrition, I've done a lot of experiential curriculums and teaching, and I've really watched the role of high quality nutritious food in an educational experience, even within an 8-day period, is stunning. And plus how deep the concepts go into when they go in somebody's ears, and how what happens with them while they're in there is very dependent on nutrition. And nutrition is a big term. It's much more than what we're thinking. We actually get our energy from at least 3 sources that I know of, and 2 of them are pretty esoteric. But we're definitely getting energy from infrared light and from the ground in the form of negative ions, the negative charge. What it does is it separates the water in our body into positive and negative forms, and it's like our whole body being, molecule-wise, 98%, not by volume, but by number of molecules, 98% water. That water can separate into positive and negative charges, and we are literally a battery. And so that is very involved in our health. And if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend looking at, you might start with Gerald Pollack's TED Talk, but he wrote a book called The Fourth Phase of Water, and it has really powerful implications on the full gamut of health and available energy. So what I'm talking about, to get it really right, say Northeastern Ohio or any good sized region, to take on a full transformation of the quality of our supply chains and ecological footprints is a lot of work. I'm not pretending otherwise, but it's joyous work when you have the energy to do it, because the feedback loops are incredibly powerful. I mean, most of what people are buying material things for is to fill a hollow set of needs that are really more spiritual in nature, and more about compounds that come from healthy social interactions, things like oxytocin and human growth hormone and dopamine and serotonin. And I really believe that this is really the underlying issues of addiction as we're seeing it as well. So it's a lot of complexity here, but I think we need to look behind the curtain a little bit, because the common stories that we're being told or that are circulating out there are clearly not addressing the issues in a systemic way, not treating temporary, not treating symptoms, but actually getting to the core of where all the symptoms arise from.
All right, thank you. That was that great answer. Here's the next question. We're a nation dominated by factory farms and food conglomerates like US Food. How do we break their grip on food supply? And is that even the right approach to more broadly relocalized farming as you are proposing?
Well, that's how we do it. We basically take away the market by producing our own and producing high quality products that so I mentioned the carrot that with 200 times the polyphenols. Any particularly mothers and grandmothers, they're a leverage point in the food system that understand that might even have a handheld infrared tool that can go through the marketplace and identify that high quality. The large-scale monocultures and confined animal operations will never compete in that world. It's only when we do not distinguish quality in the marketplace, and quality is a lot to unpack, because it implies a lot of social interactions. It implies essentially kind of the law of karma in a way. And that's not going to necessarily all come through in a nutrition measurement. So there's a lot going on there. There's actually a bill in the House to eradicate all confined animal operations in the next 20 years. Whether it gets traction or not, I don't know. But I mean, these are the things we need to pay attention to and support, because we can absolutely do this without hurting the food supply. In fact, we can actually do it way better without all that there. So a quick thought process to think about is that if you think about anybody's driven across the country and look at the sheer amount of land that's being dominated by corn and soybeans, and the vast majority of those corn and soybeans are going to livestock in confined animal operations generally, and fuel. And we can really tackle the fuel piece in a separate conversation. But if you think about the quality that happens in, say, a pasture-raised egg versus a confined animal egg, or a grass-fed, 100% grass-fed beef or dairy, I do the inspections on grass-fed, and so we go through top to bottom on that and make sure the animals never touched any grain, or they get disqualified. The amount of omega-3 fatty acids and the entire fat profile and the food value of those products is night and day to anything that these confined animal operations can compete with. But if you think about transforming the livestock that we do into these very regenerative systems that you're going to get 100 other positive values out of, from the climate to the soil health to all the biodiversity, on top of whatever product we're getting from it. And then what? We liberate vast amounts of this country for really interesting biodiversity management, which could be anything. It could be, if you look at what this country, what North America had in terms of water resources from just beaver alone, I mean, the number of millions of gallons of stored water is off the charts. And so we put in drain tiles and we've literally drained the country. Michael Kravchik's work, which is another, he wrote a book called A New Water Paradigm that's also very important and very connected to Walter Yene, who I mentioned. And he's talking about the small water cycle, which means water that originates on land, evaporates and falls back on land, not water that comes off the ocean and land and so forth. But that worldwide, we've been draining all of the continents, and that actually the oceans have been rising partly just from draining the water out of these soils, that 28,000 gallons of water storage in every acre of land from every point. So that example that I mentioned earlier about one farm that I know of, which is about 400 acres, increased 3 percentage points of organic matter from livestock. The math of that is, 28,000 times 3 for the 3 points of organic matter times 400 acres. You start to see this incredible leverage start happening. And that is really just bringing the land back to where it was at probably 5 to 7% organic matter when, Europeans arrived. So, yeah, that's a big and important topic. I talked to a guy in the USDA in Pennsylvania that has the ear of the governor of Pennsylvania and is really interested in how to transform the confined animal operations. The other really powerful model, which is, we could do an entire talk just on this one alone, is the same Indigenous man friend of mine, Reginaldo Hazlet Marroquin, fantastic person, but he came up out of Guatemala watching his people be murdered by death squads, and he designed a food system to displace that incredibly thoroughly. you know, the social, economic, ecological, all the pieces of and with a spiritual basis underneath of it. And he's the link that I had on there with the Main Street project, but he's with Regen Ag Alliance, I believe it is now. I can supply some very good resource material for you on this. It's a bit complex, but he really took a spiritual, intuitive, his training as an Indigenous person to a very deep level on this, even though it really starts looking like a lot of commodity production, but doing it in a way that overtakes the standing system. But he's using poultry as the center of that. It's called poultry-centered regenerative agroforestry. And so it's, I'd be happy to go into depth on it later, but it's a completely different ball game than raising chickens any other way we know of. For one, he doesn't feed any ground grain at all, but he does feed grain, a mix of seeds, where you're throwing the grain underneath of trees. You know, right from the beginning, he establishes, you know, if you understand a chicken, what you see is that it will never relax unless it's got an 80% canopy above it, because it's going to be worried about being picked off by hawks and other predators. And but if you design these poultry yards, and he rotates back and forth two different fields, you can do this on a smaller scale in a backyard, but he's really focused on the larger scale, like 200 farms within a 50-mile radius to produce, you know, he's got it figured out, the economics of how many eggs, how many meat birds, and the jobs that it generates in processing and so forth, and how that will tip the whole economy to where the other system won't be able to compete with it. I went and visited one of these systems in Minneapolis last winter, and it was about, I think it was either 7 or 9 year, it might have been 9-year-old system, and it was all swaled to where no raindrops were leaving that farm. It had about 200 or 300 hazelnut trees per acre. He picked hazelnuts because they absorb nitrogen incredibly fast, and that's what you have a lot of with a lot of poultry. It's still about 10% of the density that you would see even in an organic, larger scale poultry system. But the results he's getting are just amazing. The soil health. But so what he does is he throws the seed underneath. He rotates them back and forth, and the field that's being rotated with no chickens, you throw the seeds out, and in 5 days it'll sprout. Sometimes they'll throw some straw on top of it if it's a bit dry or whatever. And then 5 days after sprouting, that seed has more energy than you can get any other possible way from a grain. Actually, much more than the other ways of grinding it into a feed. And so he runs the chickens in it 5 days into the sprouting. And then meanwhile, he's sprouting the seeds underneath the other canopy. And then he rotates them back and forth. So that's a simple, quick thing, but he's got pieces of this that just, you really need a little time to watch him populate slides with ideas and time frames and how he's figured it out. Brilliant. So I think that would clearly take care of the livestock question. But I mean, in terms of establishing it, we would need to talk more in details.
All right, thank you. So I just reposted the page of links, and we will send that out as well. We'll give Mark a chance to update that page, and then we'll send it out through an email as well for anybody who's not comfortable getting to Google Docs. I want to say really quickly, at one, we had 2 different times posted. One said 3 to 4:15, the other said 3 to 4:30. So if anyone has to leave, I just wanted to take a second and say thank you for being here. We're very appreciative. And if you have to leave now, I think that, we totally understand. However, we do still have 3 more questions. So okay. Mark, are you able?
I'm good for staying, but the other thing that for anybody who does have to leave, that we are going to be doing a part 2 with more detail on specifics for right where you live. We wanted to get the kind of global picture of what we're fitting into with our local systems, and then we'll make some time and give a bunch of examples of how does that look.
Okay.
So yeah, let's go for the last three questions.
All right. So this question is, would the use of aquaponics or aquaculture be considered regenerative agriculture? And would adding a pond to your system help with soil regeneration?
So starting with the last one, definitely on adding ponds to landscapes. You know, there's a whole system came out of Australia for arid lands that's it's called a keyline system. And again, if you want to look at my longer form talk, it goes into that. But aquaponic, I would say hydroponics, I've got almost zero interest in or faith in, especially when we start to test the nutrient density, because there's an inherent role of soil, healthy soil in the way plants have evolved, unless they're aquatic plants like watercress. Aquaponics, I'm very interested in, but there's a challenge because in the vast majority of aquaponic systems, there's a non-soil medium being used, and they're relying on the nutrients only from the what's in the water from the fish. The combining fish and agriculture is brilliant, actually, and is you know, there's only about, well, there's at least 3 examples that I know of, but the Mayan Chinampa systems, which were a combination of canals that they used for transportation and fish and harvesting aquatic plants for biomass for compost, and then cropping in between them, is really brilliant. And I'll tell you why. There's also one in a couple in Southeast Asia, I believe in either Vietnam or, but they have these fish, pig, rice type options where they flood a field and grow rice, then they cycle another cycle of flooding it and growing crustaceans or fish, and then eventually come back to rice again. And they're feeding the fish and fish products to pigs in some cases, but they're coming up with very high efficiencies. But the reason why it's so brilliant to me is that I've looked at a lot of these types of systems, and agriculture in general, over time, almost always loses organic matter. It's rare to find really regenerative systems within agriculture alone. And then on the other hand, if you look at ponds, no matter where you build them, they go through a process of eutrophication where they are basically filling in and eventually turning into, if anybody's been to Hartville, Ohio, those black soils, those muck soils, also up around Toledo. Those are lakes that filled in over time by doing the opposite of eroding. You know, they built up nutrients to the point where they eventually became a bog and then black soils. So if you think about those two systems, they balance each other. And if you're rotating between the two, in the case of the Chinampas, they managed the bottoms. They took the muck off the bottoms to keep the waterways open and built that muck up onto these raised beds in between. But getting back to the aquaponics for a moment, I'm in the process of researching, and I feel like it's an important project to figure out how to do a soil medium with an aquaponics system. I mean, you can always grow fish in tanks and water the plants and then apply new water. But if you're constantly cycling the water and using the plants to essentially clean to be the aquarium filter of sorts and use the filtration as the nutrients for the plants, is basically a good idea. I just am attached to soil and building healthy soil. So I'm very interested in seeing aquaponics and am looking into this. I can't give you a working example yet, but I will find it. It's just a matter of time. So I think that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question is, how can we localize work in highly dense population cities in countries such as India?
How can we localize work? I think India is smoking us on that topic. I mean, they've got a lot of the right things in place culturally. I think they there's a number of challenges no matter where you go, but I think they have a cultural memory of things that are really important. If you look at what's going on in India right now in this large farmer uprising, they understand the bad deal that the Bill Gates and others and the GMO patenters and chemical people are trying to push on them. And you know, they were some of the first to not just to go out and carry signs against things, but they would just go and rip out the GMO crops out of the ground, period. And so India's got tremendous wisdom in this. And one of the things I'm interested in, I know for a fact they're implementing a very large tree planting process across India, and specifically within the agricultural landscapes, not taking agricultural landscapes out of commission in order to grow forests, but to integrate those tree plantings. And I didn't really, well, I guess I did. I mentioned the agroforestry transition from agriculture as we know it. There's a lot of forms of that we could talk about, but there's a lot of good cultural models, and really just India is rich in terms of having a history of deep knowledge about how to work together, how to be self-reliant, how to, I mean, they're coming out of a colonialized process, and this colonialism is really what we are needing to transcend ourselves. And for a short period of time in US history, after the American Revolution and before the Civil War, there was a period where we looked real closely at corporate personhood and the necessity to give corporations strict rules. There were 4 key rules to that happened for a while, and it's a way to really make big progress. And the rules were basically that, and this goes for governments as well, but corporations and governments don't have rights and never should have rights. They should have responsibilities to the living who have the rights. And so the early corporations had to do things that they were limited to do things that the people wanted and needed. You know, things like bridges and rail systems and so forth. And 2, they had to have transparent books. 3, there were rules about monopolies, and 4, they were revocable. It was a revocable trust. If we were to re-implement those, and we may not survive if we don't, because corporate power is now, you know, really controlling politics and just about everything. But this is a way to wrestle that power back to the people where it was always supposed to be in a democracy. I would argue we probably haven't had a democracy since the 1870s or so. But I diverged. So yeah, most of these questions could take a whole lot more time, but
Yeah. I'm going to ask, Ellie, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, I sent them to you.
You did.
Yes, so
Okay.
you read one of them, and I think I just had one other, which I had asked,
About the restoration camps?
yeah, if there were any ecological restoration camps in the US.
yes, there's at least one that I know of in Northern California up near Mount Shasta. It was initiated after the Paradise Fire. John had been giving a talk at one point and said Paradise is burning. He didn't mean Paradise, California, but he got a call from a guy who was literally, some of his children were missing in the fire, and he was driving away with his tires on fire in his vehicle and said, we need to start a camp here. And since then, they've started one there. They can be initiated anywhere by anybody who wants to start one. And there's a whole global network of training programs of how to do just about everything required. I've been thinking about some of the mountaintop removal sites in Appalachia as being a really good place to start one of these camps, and particularly leapfrogging off of some of John Todd's work along those lines. But California offhand is the only one I know of in this country. There will be more. There's lots of them springing up all over the world. So it's pretty cool. There was one in Rwanda where they had drained they put drain tiles in a high elevation wetland and drained it for agriculture. And there was a hydroelectric plant way down the mountain, and the water level to generate the power that they designed that for went down to 10%. They were having to burn diesel to run generators to make up for the lack of hydropower. And so they went up and restored the wetlands, plugged them back up, and basically and got the hydropower back up to 100%. People's water was rising in their wells like tens of miles away. And so, you can really look at whole areas of this and then go back and look at some historic ecologies. There's some work in Ethiopia and other places, and the sky's the limit, but there's really brilliant people aligning to this process. And John is just signing people up left and right who are the brightest bulbs around. So it's a very hopeful thing. And if you can afford a small amount monthly for them, they'll be powering these camps all over the place and trainings and so forth. And I think it's money very well spent. I got on board right away when I realized what they were doing. So yeah, but anyway, California is the only one that I know of so far. There may be other formative ones, but
Okay. All right. Wonderful. And then the last question was from Dave Simon, and a comment, an invitation to comment. So I think Dave has unmuted himself. Did you want to go ahead and ask that?
Yeah, I was just referencing the living machine is what they call it at Oberlin College in the Lewis Environmental Center. And I think John Todd was the designer of that, actually. It's multi-leveled, multi-stage set of pools that are contained from each other, each with a different blend of plants and animals.
yeah, he did design that. And I think David Orr brought him in for that. And John has done phenomenal work. I was highly inspired when I was in my early 20s. I went out to Cape Cod and visited one of these bioshelters that they built, which was about 0 degrees outside in Cape Cod. And there was a 120-foot building that was 100% solar and wind powered, and growing bananas, and 8-foot walls of tomatoes, and fish tanks with translucent fish tanks growing algae that the fish were eating. And I was just blown away by that. It was partly that, it was partly a bunch of other ecological principles that I found to be very impressive. Like, in greenhouses, it's common to introduce ecological predators to eat the insects that are a potential problem. They took it another step farther. They went, instead of introducing a predator that would eat all of the pest insects, they would put habitat in there, things like comfrey with the little hairs in the leaves that some of the whiteflies or aphids could escape, just to keep enough of a population of the predator to be kind of steady state, where they would never get to be high enough population to be a big problem, and the predators would stay alive. And so you're beginning to really balance an ecosystem there. Very impressed with that. And I've went down and visited their property in Costa Rica that they started down there, and it was very similar to some of the work I was doing in Central America. So yeah, John Todd's an amazing guy. I did a training with him and his son last year down in North Carolina on aquatic, basically bioremediation in aquatic settings on lakes and ponds. And one of the ones that early on like blew me away is they took a toxic lake. I mean, so toxic that the life in the benthic layer in the bottom mud of the lake was dead. And they took they designed a floating island with 9 aquatic chambers in it, and a a windmill in the middle with a pump that pumped water off the bottom up into the first tank. And there was really kind of primitive organisms, bacteria and algae and things in the first tank. And the second tank, a little bit more advanced organisms, and all the way up to, you know, some fish and crustaceans and things in the 9th chamber. And so every time the wind blew, water pumped off the bottom and went through all these chambers and was slowly cleaning the lake. And after a year of that thing just sitting in the wind, cleaning the lake with biology, life started being breathed back into the benthic layer, and the lake began to return to life. I mean, that's just pure brilliance as far as I'm concerned. And so, yeah, anything you can read by John Todd and look at what he's done, very impressive person and work.
All right. Okay, great. The last question we have is Kim, and she's going to ask.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple times about John Liu's restoration camps and supporting his work with donations. What do we search for that?
Ecosystem restoration camps will take you to the site. And if you have any trouble with it at all, feel free to let me know, since I'm on their advisory board, and I'll be happy to walk you through whatever level of interface you'd like. And feel free to put my contact information on that email that goes out for everybody today, for anybody that has follow-up questions or thoughts.
Thank you.
All right. Wonderful. I think Anne is going to close.
I just want to say thank you so much, Mark. This was incredible. So much to think about and look into. I want to let everybody know Mark is going to give another program April 10th, which is a Saturday at 3 p.m. And it's going to be entitled How Holistic Stewardship Can Restore Health from Backyards to Supply Chains. So it'll be similar material with just a little bit different slant. So thanks so much, everybody, for being with us. And we are recording this, and probably in a week or so, we'll have it up on our YouTube channel. So thanks so
Very
much.
good. Thank you. Thanks for everybody
Mark. Thank you.
showing up. Yeah.
All right. Take
Be
care.
well.
Everybody. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
On my knees, I belong, I believe. Oh,